everybody, to what has become, I think, my favorite morning of the year at the O'Donnell Middle School, our Veterans Day Assembly. First, I'd like to welcome all of the veterans, whether or not they're going to be on stage or presented this morning. 8th graders, I'd just like to welcome our stars of the day, our veterans, to the O'Donnell Middle School. I will introduce the program, and then I will be off of the podium pretty quickly. I do want to thank the two folks here at the O'Donnell Middle School who are really largely responsible for coordinating this assembly. First, the assistant principal who really puts in all of the work to get this thing going, Mr. David Goyder. And to our head teacher for social studies, who put in all sorts of work to get today going as well, Ms. Caitlin Valaire. This morning really has a special meeting for our students so that they can get an appreciation for the service and sacrifice of our veterans. I will certainly let Mr. Goyder speak a little bit more about that when he gets up here. The other person and people I would like to thank Mr. John Kearns, our band director, and the best 8th grade band in the United States of America, the O'Donnell Middle School 8th grade band. So without further ado, I'm going to ask folks to rise while the band plays our national anthem. Thank you, band. What a great job. Okay, you may be seated. And now I'd like to introduce Mr. David Goyder.
Good morning, everyone. It is such an honor to be here this morning with our veterans and 8th grade students. So thankful that we have the opportunity to recognize their service. This will be a wonderful assembly, and I hope that you remember this for a long time, 8th grade students, and that's our wish for you today. Over the past week, 8th grade students have interviewed a number of veterans, and they came, starting last week, they came in after school, and Ms. Valaire took a lot of great photos, and we presented a slideshow, and we have a great plan for today. But before we get started, you may have noticed in the back of the cafeteria, we have a number of veterans back there. I'm going to ask those veterans to please come down the center aisle and join me up here on the stage. And if we could give them a warm O'Donnell Middle School welcome, that would be great. please have a seat. Before we get started with our program today, there's a number of people that I want to thank and recognize. I know Mr. Colantonio mentioned a few, but I just want to make sure that I get everyone, because putting on a presentation like this requires the help and assistance of a lot of people and a lot of effort. So, Carolyn Borst from the Council on Aging, thank you for providing the breakfast this morning. Mr. Homer, thank you for your help setting up the cafeteria, along with Ms. Benitez and Ms. Buell's students. Our 8th grade social studies teachers, Mr. Grasso and Ms. Frasca, for helping select the students. Today from the Stoughton Media Access Corporation, we have Jeff Pickett and CJ Mullen. Thank you for publicizing this. Mr. Clough, thank you for helping out with the IT. Thank you very much, Mr. Clough. And absolutely, Ms. Valera has been instrumental in improving this assembly and doing a great job, so thank you. And finally, our 8th grade band, they've been recognized once, but it doesn't hurt to recognize them again. This is their first rehearsal. They sound wonderful. Their first rehearsal as a band. Thank you. So, each year, Veterans Day is recognized on November 11th. It's November 11th every year. And the reason why it's November 11th every year is because World War I ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Veterans Day became a national holiday where we recognize the service of all veterans. I'm now going to turn it over to Ms. Valera.
When Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner almost 200 years ago, he called America the land of the free and the home of the brave. Those words are as true today as they were then. Throughout this nation's history, America's soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen have bravely answered the call to defend our freedom, to aid our friends and allies, and to turn back aggressors. We can never fully repay our debt of gratitude to the more than 650,000 American service members who died in battle, or the 1.4 million who were wounded. We can, however, recognize and thank the 25 million veterans still living today. These words are inscribed on the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Our nation honors her sons and daughters who answered the call to defend a country they never knew and a people they never met. Those words apply equally to many of our World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korean, Gulf, Iraq, and Afghanistan veterans as well. They apply to today's active duty service members, tomorrow's veterans, who are helping to maintain peace throughout the world. Today, it is our privilege to say thank you to all of America's veterans, to let them know that we appreciate them for their service and honor them for all of their sacrifices. The price of freedom is high. We cannot afford to forget those willing to pay it. Today, we celebrate America's veterans for keeping this nation the land of the free and the home of the brave. Thank you.
The veterans that we have with us today are humble men and women, very humble, and oftentimes it's hard to get them to talk about their service to their country. We are so fortunate that many of them today shared their stories with 8th grade students. It's always special for me personally when one of our 8th grade students is presenting a family member, father, mother, cousin, nephew. So our first presenter today will be Gianna Hardy. Gianna, come on up. She's going to be presenting her father, Detective Roger Hardy. Detective Hardy, please stand up.
am Gianna Hardy. I would like to introduce Mr. Hardy. Mr. Hardy is a veteran of the Persian Gulf War, aka Operation Desert Storm, and was in the United States Army. Mr. Detective Hardy grew up in Stoughton, Massachusetts. Mr. Hardy entered the military when he was only 18 years old. Mr. Hardy joined the military because he could not decide what career he would like to continue and joined the military to help pay for college. The pictures of Mr. Hardy are of Operation Desert Storm during the Persian Gulf War. He served in the Army after graduating from Stoughton High School in 1988. He was stationed in Frankfurt, West Germany with the 3rd Armored Division. On Christmas Eve in 1990, he was deployed to Saudi Arabia. He helped liberate Kuwait when the war began in February of 1991. Mr. Hardy would like the students of OMS to know that he, just like us, was a student at Stoughton Public Schools and is very proud of his service and to be an American. One of my dad's prized possessions is the American flag, which is frayed and tattered in black from soot, which he carried throughout the war. This flag hangs proudly in our home. Thank you, Mr. Hardy, for your service to our country.
Our next veteran is also very familiar to the middle school. Our school resource officer, Officer Isabel, please stand up. She will be presented by Lexi Bautista. Lexi, come on up.
Hi, I'm Lex Baptista, and I would like to introduce you to Officer Isabel. Officer Isabel is a veteran of the Operation Iraqi Freedom. Officer Isabel grew up in Maine and Massachusetts. She entered the military when she was only 17 years old, and she joined the military because she wanted to pay for college and needed to travel the world. Herself and Staff Sergeant Alisea were part of an article about external fixations and applications to cadavers in Army Times magazine. Cadavers are people who have passed away and donated their body to science, so people can do procedures on them. She also did surgery on a number of dogs. Whether it's for their teeth or eating their toys. The dogs were used for bomb sniffing and weapon searching. Officer Isabel would like the students of OMS to know that joining the military is the best thing you could do. You make friendships that will last a lifetime, and it's not being friends with someone and fighting the next day. It's you're willing to die for these people. When you see a veteran, thank them. Thank you, Officer Isabel, for your service to our country.
Mr. Mike Mazzara, please stand up. Mr. Mazzara is also our Veterans Agent in Stoughton and does a tremendous amount of work for veterans in this community. He will be presented by Stephen Fay.
Hi, I'm Stephen Fay. I would like to introduce Mr. Pizarro. Mr. Pizarro is a veteran of the Vietnam War. He was a Marine Corps. He grew up in Malden, Mass. He entered the military when he was 20 years old. He joined the military because he dropped out of high school and most of his friends were in the military. Most memorable moments when he was in the military, he met President Nixon. And when he was done with the war, when he came back, he went to college and studied finance. Mr. Pizarro would like the students of OMS to know the difficulty of going to war is leaving your family behind. Thank you, Mr. Pizarro, for fighting for our country.
We have Miss Charlene Jocelyn with us today. She's right over to my right. Charlene's right over, and she was presented by Karina Alves. Karina, please come up.
Too short. Hi, I'm Karina Alves. I would like to introduce Charlene Jocelyn. She is a veteran of the Vietnam War, and she grew up in Nantasket. She entered the military when she was just 18 years old, and she joined because she grew up learning all about the military because her father wanted to go, but he had injuries to his feet, so he couldn't. So she joined to make her father proud. A memorable moment she had was when visiting her friend Misty in a pool. The AG Farben building collapsed and she realized that they were at war. After the war, she she went to college for a business school during the day, and at night she was a fire aide for handicapped people and would help them if they woke up, like reading stories to them and other things. And Miss Jocelyn would like the students to know to be good to each other, because when a friend is hurt, you need to pick them up and ask what you can do to help. This way you can have something good in your heart, something in your heart that you know is good. Thank you, Miss Jocelyn, for your service to our country.
Our next veteran is Mr. Paul Flynn. He usually joins us, but this morning he had to be with his grandchildren, so we are going to present him. Will Kent, please come out. Will Kent.
Hi, I'm Will Kent, and I would like to introduce you to Mr. Paul Flynn. Unfortunately, like Mr. Goyder said, Paul Flynn could not be here today. Mr. Flynn grew up in Stoughton, and he enlisted in the military when he was 20 to serve his country. Mr. Flynn was a veteran of the Vietnam War and was in Tay Ninh as a communications lineman. His job was to climb the telephone poles and fix communication wires. When he was on one of the poles, he was shot at 5 times, but luckily all of them missed. He was deployed in Vietnam for 1 year and 2 months from 1965 to 1966. He recently had his 50-year reunion with fellow soldiers. In 1980, he enlisted with the Army Reserve for 1 year as a medic and EMT. Mr. Flynn would like you to know that being in the military is nothing to be afraid of. It would teach you how to grow up and be self-sufficient. You should never forget soldiers when they come home, so that they can get proper care. Mr. Flynn also volunteered to help veterans with PTSD and also helped create Faxon Park to honor veterans.
Mr. Hank Herbawi, please stand up. Mr. Herbawi will be presented by Stephen Fay.
I would like to introduce Mr. Herbawi. Mr. Herbawi is a veteran of the Korean War. He grew up in Pittsfield, Mass. He entered the military when he was 16, but they found out he was too young, so he had to rejoin at 19. And then he joined the military because one of his fellow relatives was a Marine. One of the most memorable moments when he was in the Korean War was when an earthquake hit the island and destroyed the whole island other than 4 buildings. After the war, he went into Korea and Hangam, Mass, and it was like where they stored all the ammo. And Mr. Herbawi would like the students to know they didn't win the war, but it was an even tie. And being in the war is kind of hard, but it's an experience for young adults. Thank you, Mr. Herbawi, for serving our country.
Mr. Robert Goldberg, please stand up. Mr. Robert Goldberg. Mr. Goldberg will be presented by Bridget Goyder.
Hello, I'm Bridget Boyer. I would like to introduce Mr. Robert Goldberg. He is a veteran of the Korean War. He grew up in Roxbury, Massachusetts. He entered the military when he was 19. He joined because he was drafted to fight in 1961. He fought for 13 months. He was a corporal in the Army. And some of his most memorable moments was that when he was fighting, the Jeep that he came in blew up so that he got a second Jeep to go back home, a brand new one. And another one is that he got fresh, clean socks. And after the war, he went to Northeastern. He went to Washington for a while, and he sold furniture around New England until he retired. And Mr. Goldberg would like the students to know that you should move to Florida because it's beautiful there. and that you should do the best that you can. Don't stop at high school. You should go on to college to get a good master's degree. Thank you, Mr. Goldberg, for your service to our country.
Mr. Irving Salzman, please stand up. He will be presented by Sanaya Swain Price. Sanaya, please come up.
Nice and loud and slow.
Hello, I am Sanai Swain Price, and I would like to introduce Mr. Salzman. Mr. Salzman is a veteran of the Korean War, and he grew up in Roxbury and Dorchester. Mr. Salzman entered the war when he was 26 in 1952. He joined the war because he got drafted. Some of his most memorable moments were when he lived in a hole for a year and the Quad 50s and the airstrikes. After the war, Mr. Salzman pursued a career in plumbing. Mr. Salzman would like you guys to know that the military teaches responsibility, and that he used to plumb for 75 years. And he's been all around the world, like Australia, the Panama Canal, Hawaii, and Alaska. And he has 2 sons. Thank you, Mr. Salzman, for your service to our country.
We are so fortunate to have a number of these veterans that come back year after year as we've been running this program and just have been an instrumental part of this process. Mr. Noe, please stand up. Mr. Noe is absolutely one of those people. He will be presented by Rebecca Lally.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Lally, and I'd like to introduce Mr. Noe. Mr. Noe is a veteran of the Korean War. Mr. Noe grew up on the west side of Boston, Massachusetts. Mr. Noe entered the Army when he was 18 years old. It was 1950 when he joined. He served in the military for a total of 3 years and served 1 year overseas in Korea. Mr. Noe joined the military because he wanted to protect the people of South Korea and protect America. He also wanted to fight the communists in North Korea. Mr. Noe joined the military 2 days after the war was announced. At the time, people found it odd that he would sign up to go to war. Most people who were in the military during the war had been drafted. While in the military, Mr. Noe earned the Combat Infantry Badge and 3 Bronze Stars. The pictures of Mr. Noe are of him in Korea. Pictures were taken on Gibraltar Hill, where he had been stationed during his time in Korea. Mr. Noe would like the students of OMS to know that even though it was scary to fight in a war, it was worth it to fight for America and its freedoms. He'd also like everyone to know that the freedoms America has are not free. Freedom isn't free. When Mr. Noe came back to the States after his time in Korea, he met his wife Lucille, and they have now been married for 58 years. Mr. Noe also wanted me to add that he would like to thank the Stoughton veteran agent Mike Pizarro for helping him get what he earned during his time in the military. Thank you, Mr. Noe, for your service to our country.
Mr. Charlie Wade, please stand up. Mr. Charlie Wade will be presented by Rada Luke.
Hello, my name is Rada Luke. I would like to introduce Mr. Charlie Wade. Mr. Wade is a veteran of of the Korean War. Mr. Wade grew up in Stoughton, Massachusetts. Mr. Wade entered the military when he was 21 years old. Mr. Wade joined the military because he was drafted by his uncle. The pictures of Mr. Wade are from the Korean War and how they lived. They had to sleep on the ground and they had to go around the borders of Russia and Germany. Mr. Wade would like to, Mr. Wade also does the square dedications in memorial parks to honor the veterans that have either passed away or are still doing service. Mr. Wade would like the students of OMS to know that to not take the advantages and liberties they have and to not take them for granted. A famous quote Mr. Wade told me is that all gave some and some gave all. Thank you, Mr. Wade, for giving your service to our country.
Mr. Wade asked to address the student body, so I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Wade for a moment.
Thank you very much. I would like you students to look at these veterans that are assembled here today. Ladies and gentlemen, who all did time in the military on behalf of our great country. And part of signing up in the military, you put your life on the line. You know you may never return. And that's something that scared me when I first left this country. But these people served with pride, served with honor, to protect the privileges and the benefits that we all share and many people take for granted. I would like to say to you students assembled here today, if such a thing happened in this country with all the unrest around the world, would you be willing to serve and put your life on the line? I don't want an answer, but it's something to consider. All these people did their military time, and I think they feel as I do. Proud to have served, and thank you for having us here today. Thank you.
Many people in this room grew up in Stoughton. I'm proud to say that I grew up in Stoughton, and I grew up on a street, Malcolm Road. Malcolm Road is named after World War I veteran from Stoughton. He gave his life during World War I. Many of the streets in Stoughton are named after people, men and women, that have made the ultimate sacrifice. You may not know the origin of your street name, but many of the streets in Stoughton have that history behind them. When I was growing up, I was fortunate to have a number of World War II veterans on my street, and Mr. Richard Cellino was across the street from me, and he's here with us this morning. Mr. Cellino, please stand up. Mr. Cellino, he's right there, he's back there, he's got it. And Mr. Cellino this morning is presented by Haley Hopkins. Haley, come on up.
Hello, I am Haley Hopkins. I would like to introduce Mr. Richard Cellino. Mr. Cellino is a veteran of World War II. He grew up in Quincy. He entered the military when he was 21. Mr. Cellino joined the military because he wanted to serve his country. Some of his most memorable moments are at the end of the war and before then, landing in Iwo Jima. After he pursued a career in journalism, Mr. Cellino would like the students to know that people who served are very proud of their accomplishments. Thank you, Mr. Cellino, for your service to our country.
Our next veteran from World War II is Dawne De Janeiro. Dawne, please stand up. He's raising his hand. He's right over there. Dawne is going to be presented by Alyssa. Please come up, Alyssa.
Hi, I'm Alyssa Eustache. I would like to introduce Mr. Dawne De Janeiro. Mr. De Janeiro was a peacetime soldier after World War II in the Army in the infantry part. Mr. De Janeiro grew up in Canton, Massachusetts. Mr. De Janeiro entered the military when he was 23. He got drafted by the Army in 1957. Some most memorable moments he would like for you to know is that he communicated with soldiers and that he did a lot of marching with the soldiers up to 10 to 15 miles. After the war, he pursued a career in building construction, especially single-family homes. Mr. De Janeiro would like the students to know that Germany is a very nice country, and Germany is very packed, and just in 3 hours you could go from one side to the other side of Germany. He thinks that Germany has plenty to do, many places to go. He served for 2 years, from 1957 to 1959. He went to 5 different countries. He met relatives in Italy for the first time. He served 1 year and 6 months in Germany and 6 months in USA for training. Thank you, Mr. De Janeiro, for your service to your country.
Mr. John Corvis. Mr. John Corvis is in the crowd. If he could raise his hand or stand up. Mr. Corvis is right over there to my right. Leah Sages, please come up. Leah.
Hi, I'm Leah Sages. I would like to introduce Mr. John Corvis. Mr. Corvis was a veteran of World War II and the Korean War. He was a part of the Air Force. Mr. Corvis grew up in Lowell, Massachusetts. Mr. Corvis entered the military when he was 20 years old. Mr. Corvis joined the military because he was drafted. Some of his most memorable moments were when he was in Paris, France, and the Germans started coming in. After the war, he pursued a career in food. He owned a restaurant. Mr. Corvis would like the students to know that the whole world has gone crazy. Thank you, Mr. Corvis, for your service of our country.
Mr. Anthony Novello, please stand up. Mr. Anthony Novello. Sri, come on up.
Hello, my name is Shri, and I'd like to introduce Mr. Anthony Novello. Mr. Novello is a veteran of World War II, and Mr. Novello grew up in Everett, but he was born in Boston. Mr. Novello entered the military when he was almost 18 in July 1943. He joined the military because of World War II and to join his friends. The pictures of Mr. Novello are from World War II in Japan. He's in Japan with the flag, and his friends in the picture are from all over the country. Mr. Novello was one of 9 children. He delivered papers until he was 14. He worked for the Greyhound Bus Company, and he worked full-time from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. and he got home in time for school. In 1943, he went into service. He gave up a football scholarship. He went into Hawaii first, and he saw his friend Charles. That was his happiest moment. Iwo Jima was a lot harder than I anticipated. A ship was bombed, and that's how most people got hurt. He was a wireman, and he worked with communication, and he dropped wires around and climbed trees. He was overseas for 2.5 years, and he came home in January 1946. When he came home, he wanted to be a gym teacher, but instead he became a lieutenant of the Stoughton Fire Department for 35 years. He coached kids baseball, and the baseball field in Stoughton is named after him. He has 3 kids, and 2 are in the Air Force. Mr. Novello would like the students of OMS to know that you should never count yourself out in life. Work hard and it'll pay off. Thank you, Mr. Novello, for your service to our country.
It is such an honor to have all the veterans with us today. And this is the World War II ended 70 years ago. 70 years ago, and we still have so many World War II veterans. We are so fortunate to have them with us today. And the stories that you're hearing, if you know your history, when you hear words like Iwo Jima, Battle in the Pacific, Desert Storm, I hope you look those up and get an understanding of what happened. You will truly appreciate the service of these men and women. Our next veteran is Mr. Joseph DeVito. Mr. DeVito, please stand up. Mr. DeVito is going to be presented by Sarah Doherty.
Hello, my name is Sarah Doherty. I would like to introduce Mr. DeVito. Mr. DeVito is a veteran of World War II. He was in the Navy and served for around 5 months. He traveled all around the world's oceans defending the United States and freedom. Mr. DeVito grew up in Stoughton. He was born in 1926 and lived in a house right across the street from the Stoughton Public Library. He went through the Stoughton public school systems. He worked with his father in many local businesses. He is now the president of the Stoughton Historical Society alongside his wife, who works as the secretary. He entered the military at only 17 years old, immediately after graduating from Stoughton High School. Other than the fact that it was pretty much an obligation, Mr. DeVito joined the Army because he was inspired by past soldiers. Also, the majority of his graduating friends were joining the military. The pictures of Mr. DeVito are from high school graduation, in which he enlisted in the military the next day when he got out of boot camp and visited his sisters, a patch that signified that he worked on the patrol torpedo, and one of the carpenter ships that he worked on called the Sumner. Mr. DeVito would like the students of OMS to know that education is the base of everything that you will go on to do in life. If life is a pyramid, education is equivalent to the foundation, and without it, the majority of things will not work out. Thank you, Mr. DeVito, for your service to our country.
Over the years, I've had a chance to get to know many of these veterans on a very personal level, and Joe is one of those people, and one of his favorite stories that I always remember is him meeting JFK after World War II. Mr. DeVito met him and had an opportunity to spend 30 minutes with him just in conversation. So that is a quite spectacular experience that he had. I would like to, the portion of our assembly where the students present is concluded. I would like to thank these students for being so brave to come up here in front of their classmates and everyone else. So great job, 8th grade students. It takes a lot to come up here in front of your classmates, your teachers, and everyone else. So we really appreciate that. Before we conclude this morning, Mr. Mike Pizarra, our veterans agent here in Stoughton, would like to have a few words with you.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank you all for your hospitality for being here today. It seems to get better every year, and I'd like to have all of you give yourselves a hand. Thank you all very much on behalf of all of the veterans here. it was mentioned earlier that only 25 million veterans were left. The statistic I use, only about 5% of the people in the country remain as veterans, and only about 1% of our younger generation actually serves in the military now. And so I just say, when you talk about history, you would remember the words of Winston Churchill during the Battle of Britain, when the RAF pilots, kept the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, at bay, and England was to survive. And Winston Churchill said, never before in the course of human history, or something to that effect, have so many owed so much to so few. And that's sort of what it's getting like now with the United States military, with such a small percentage of people serving and doing so much for our great country. So, we really do appreciate everything that you've done for us. And here's something that, that you can do maybe to help us on, I think it's in the back of the board. This Saturday, we'll be reflagging the graves of our veterans of our Holy Sepulchre and Evergreen cemeteries. Those are the two largest cemeteries, the two most active cemeteries in the town. We'll be meeting at the VFW at 10 o'clock. You probably all know where that is, by the new Shell station, and from there we'll be splitting up between Evergreen Cemetery and Holy Sepulchre. It really is it can be a moving experience, helping those, in their final resting place, those who came before us and gave all of us, especially you younger people, all the great freedoms and opportunities that you have today. As well, you're all invited on November 11th to our Veterans Day Parade. As was stated earlier, it's always on November 11th, no matter what day it is, whether it's a weekend or a work day or a school day. I think you guys all get that day off. We have a nice parade. There's a lot of participants. I think we have a couple of our state representatives. I don't know if they teach civics in school anymore, but state representatives are important people, and they'll be there. And I think we're going to have Charlie Wade, who spoke earlier. He wants to make a presentation at Faxon Veterans Memorial Park. And everybody after the parade is invited back to the VFW for donuts and soft drinks and Shirley Temples and that type of thing. So I want to thank you all again for being here, and I hope you can help us with the reflagging of the graves, and I hope to see you all on Veterans Day, and thank you very much again.
That concludes our 2015 Veterans Day Assembly. Students, I'm going to have you stay seated. Our band has some patriotic songs that they're going to play. And we're going to first dismiss, we're going to have the veterans and their families leave first, and then the students will stay seated. So the veterans that are sitting to my right, if you could exit out those doors and you can head back to the media center if you need to. You can follow Mr. McCarran. One last round of applause for these special men and women with us today.